It's been nearly 70 years since the Japanese bombed Darwin in World War II. Countering the stories of devastation and destruction caused by the Japanese, the Northern Territory Library is exhibiting a tale of salvage and reconciliation. The collection shows how a team of Japanese salvors, headed by a man named Ryuga Fujita, pulled large sunken wrecks from Darwin Harbour. The exhibition shows how dredging up the past helped heal the territory's war wounds. It was the first attack by a foreign force on Australian soil. On the 19th of February 1942, just months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attacked Darwin City. 188 Japanese aircraft descended on the territory, launching the first of many raids that would stretch out over 2 years.
These big white crosses coming across in formation. We fired on them with no effect. The first raid lasted about 45 minutes. When the high-level bombers had done their carpet bombing of the town and the aerodrome, they moved out, and the fighters and dive bombers moved in, and they attacked the ships.
More than 240 Allied soldiers were killed during the attack. Hundreds more were wounded. 8 ships were sunk in Darwin Harbour, among them 2 supply ships laden with war trucks and ammunition for the effort in Timor, and the American destroyer, the USS Peary, that went down with more than 90 soldiers on board.
I saw the Peary go down, and the chap in the front of the Peary was still firing his gun as he went under the ocean. Fantastic.
This was the biggest combat action that Australia's ever seen in Darwin and around Darwin Harbour. The Japanese force swept all before them, and we lost ships and people quite substantially.
Almost 2 decades later, and the town of Darwin was forced to dig up the past. The sunken war wrecks were proving to be a shipping hazard. By 1959, the Australian government had contracted the only salvage team in the world capable of lifting the wrecks from their watery grave. The team of salvors were Japanese.
They all knew it was incredibly ironic. So how did the Darwin community deal with that? How did Fujita deal with that? How did the government deal with that? How did they sort of reignite these relationships and deal with this issue of reconciliation?
Well, in Melbourne and Sydney, of course, there was a lot of outrage and carry-on. In Darwin, which has always been, to use a term, multicultural, we had Japanese in big numbers before the war. So local unionists told unionists in Melbourne and Sydney to shut up. They didn't know what they were talking about.
Mr. Fujita was contracted to do the job. He came to Australia with his 2 sons and more than 120 crew to begin what would be a 2-year effort clearing the harbour.
The first thing they did was to raise a sunken oil tanker called the British Motorist, an extraordinary feat. And then they put wooden huts on it and turned it into their accommodation for their entire workforce.
They called it Hotel Darwin, and they had dignitaries come, and they had dancers and all this sort of thing aboard it.
Ladies used to go out there with long gloves and hats and eat sake, eat sushi and drink sake, and even Dame Paddy Menzies, the wife of the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Menzies, went out as a guest on a British Motorist.
The salvage team dragged thousands of tonnes of metal from the seabed, but large tidal movements and poor visibility in Darwin Harbour meant it was an arduous operation. The Fujita family deployed giant canvas bags in sunken hulls and pumped them full of air to raise the ships. The rusty steel was cut into sheets, stacked into piles and loaded onto ships bound for Japan.
The quality of the metal we recovered was actually quite good, so the metals were very helpful in Japan's development.
The story of Mr. Fujita's work in Darwin only resurfaced last year with the visit of his son to the territory. Senichiro Fujita donated footage, photographs and documents of the salvage to the State Library. He maintains a strong connection to the territory and its people, who welcomed his family so warmly more than 50 years ago.
When they started the salvage process, they pulled up a lot of the brass scrap from the wrecks. They took that brass back to Japan. They fashioned them into over 70 crucifixes and donated them to the church as a sort of a symbol of peace and reconciliation.
The administration asked if they could do something that wasn't in the contract, and that is to salvage the USS Peary, which was a much more difficult project because it was in deeper water and very fast-running currents. And he agreed to do that and did it for no cost.
So they had this dilemma, this question of, well, are these just shipping hazards that had to be removed, or are they monuments of the war that had to be kept and preserved?
The Fujita collection is on display at the Northern Territory Library.
My favourite image I have of the entire exhibition is this.
Included is a photograph of the final resting place of Mr. Fujita, marked by a propeller blade from one of the Darwin wrecks. It's just another facet of what became much more than a salvage operation.
It's a great maritime story, it's a great engineering story, it's a great shipwreck story, but it's also a great story about people coming back together and how a community managed that situation.